Good morning, everybody, and welcome in. Whoa, I'm loud. I just wanted to remind everybody really quickly that we have a special program that is being sponsored by the Art History Department over at Meadows School next Thursday evening. If you're interested in Dali, and this is Thursday, October 11th at 5 o'clock p.m. I have flyers on the table over there. And it's Dali's Persistence of Memory from the Universal to the Ultra-Local, and that will be by Elliot King, who's Associate Professor of Art History at Washington and Lee University. He's a late Dali scholar, but he's recently turned his attention to the persistence of memory, and should be a really interesting program. That program is at 5 o'clock p.m. It is not the standard time of our programming here at the museum, and it is an art history program. So if you're interested in that, please pick up a flyer. It'll tell you where to go over at Meadows School for that program. It's a little complicated to get to, but there will be signage over there. Beyond that, I would like to remind all of you, next week we will not have the Friday morning lecture series, so we will skip week 4 on the 12th of October, and we will resume the following week, which of course I do not have in my head the dates, but
the 19th?
Yes, the 19th. That's absolutely correct.
Right, excellent.
Yeah. So October 19th, we'll be back together, and I will have Carrie send out a members e-blast to remind everybody about that. So, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Josh and let him talk about the Golden Age of Surrealism.
Thank you. Hello, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all again. Welcome. So if you've been with us these past 2 weeks, you know that we've been building up to the year 1929, when Dali formally emerges into the Surrealist movement in Paris. Sorry. And so that's where I want to begin today. By the end of 1929, the Surrealist group had faced a year of turbulence, much of it self-imposed by its leader, André Breton. Some of this was personal. Breton's marriage to his wife Simone finally officially crumbled, and his love affair with another woman ended. And it seems that Breton vented much of his dissatisfaction and anger out publicly, both at his fellow Surrealists and others. Several key events would set up 1929 as a year of discord among the group, leading many historians to dub it the crisis of 1929. Just a few... Sorry. Hello? Okay. just a few of these events. In March, Breton and other Surrealists infamously led a tribunal of other revolutionary writers. This is, again, Breton trying to crack down on what Surrealism's place is with the French Communist Party and the Communist Revolution broadly. Especially a younger group of writers from a group called the Grand Jeu. These writers were associated with, and also writers associated with a socialist publication we talked about before, Clarta. And in particular, Breton was singling out Surrealists he felt were not fully committed to the political cause. This event was not only a show of his control. It seems Breton felt threatened by all that he called out, but it also led to a mass exodus of key members of the group. Around 20 in all just ended up just leaving because partly they felt like Breton was pushing them out. People like Georges Bataille, who founded his own journal called Documents, and that journal featured a number of ex-Surrealists like Robert Desnos, André Masson, and others, names that should hopefully sound familiar. The same group later wrote a scathing rebuttal about Breton called A Corpse that painted, both figuratively and literally, Breton as a Christ-like martyr, which was especially galling to Breton because he was infamously very anti-Catholic. Moreover, the entire situation was exacerbated by Breton's publication of the Second Manifesto of Surrealism, which excoriated former Surrealists he had excommunicated, particularly for what he considered their lack of dedication to the communist revolution, which he also attempted to, and many people pointed out rather badly, outline the way Surrealism could serve yet again this communist cause. I think it's instrumental to point out that Mark Palizzati, who's written a lot on Breton and wrote a great biography of him, has described this period like this. Again, this is throughout 1929, is, quote, "Surrealism was no longer a state of mind unto itself, but a moral imperative. It was indicative of Breton's mood and circumstances that this manifesto, unlike its predecessor, was addressed not to the very few who had met this imperative, but to the many who had betrayed it along the way." It was during this troubled period, though, that some other figures began to feature more in the Surrealist group, such as the Belgian painter René Magritte, who moved to Paris for a year to be closer to the core Surrealist group. Here is Magritte here, and this collage image called "I Do Not See the Woman Hidden in the Forest" it features a painting by Magritte right here in the middle. By almost all accounts, Magritte hated his year in Paris. He did not get on well with the core Surrealists, definitely did not get on well with Breton. This was certainly exacerbated and enhanced when at a gathering of Surrealists, Magritte and his wife Georgette were there, and Breton noticed that Georgette was wearing a crucifix around her neck and freaked out and screamed at her. That did not set up their ongoing relationship well whatsoever. But, of course, it is also during this period that another member enters into the group. Here he is right here, our little Catalan friend, Salvador Dalí. Following Dali's preliminary visit to Paris in 1926, he had, which we ended with last time, he had continued not just developing his own style, but this is also after he's officially thrown out of the Art Academy. He is not only just reading Freud and others, he's also very actively, very consciously reading Breton's writings. So he understands the sensibilities, the ideas underpinning Surrealism, especially Bretonian Surrealism through Breton. And he returns to Paris in 1929, meeting through his fellow Catalan compatriot, Jean Miro, those within the Surrealist orbit. Many people point out probably the first core Surrealist that he met was Paul Éluard, which is somewhat interesting, not just because of Éluard's very long-standing place near Breton in the group and at the foundation of Surrealism, but of course because Éluard's wife Gala would later be Dali's obsession and love and lifelong companion. Although Dali does not meet Gala until later, when a group of Surrealists come out to Cadaqués to meet him. This includes the Magrittes, Paul Éluard and Gala, and the art dealer Camille Gomez. Now, apart from meeting the Surrealists, though, Dali's full purpose in Paris was to join his friend and fellow Spaniard Louis Buñuel in making their first film together, titled, or would become titled, Un Chien Andalou. According to Dali in The Secret Life, this collaboration came about when, quote, this is Dali writing, Louis Buñuel one day outlined to me an idea he had for a motion picture that he wanted to make, for which his mother was going to lend him the money. His idea for a film struck me as extremely mediocre. It was advanced-garde, Dali's phrasing for avant-garde, in an incredibly naive sort of way. So banal and cheap in its sentimentality revolted me, and I told him that this film story of his did not have the slightest interest, but that I, on the other hand, had just written a very short scenario which had the touch of genius, and which went completely counter to the contemporary cinema. Okay, as we've talked about many times, we have to take everything Dali says in The Secret Life with a grain of salt. Much of this is Dali self-aggrandizing, his involvement. Elliot King has described Buñuel had originally wanted to make a film titled Caprichos, based on short stories by a Spanish writer, Ramon Gómez de la Serna. And he had already gotten an investment of money from his mother to make a film, but when Gómez de la Serna kind of failed to deliver a screenplay and a treatment for the film, Dali kind of stepped in and mentioned he had written a short film scenario supposedly on the top of a shoebox. So here is, on the far left, Dali. Here is Bunel. They are on the coast of Le Havre, where they filmed the very end of the film. This is the female star of the film. This is an actor who's going to feature just in the very last scene, and this is Bunel's fiance right here. This is right around 1929. He looks so happy. Now, Bunel himself described the two of them fleshing out the final screenplay in a much more collaborative stream of consciousness way. He wrote, quote, "We wrote with our minds open to the first ideas that came into them, and at the same time systematically rejecting everything that arose from our culture and education. They had to be images that would surprise us and that we would both accept without discussion, nothing else." Now, in his description, there's actually a very long, he goes into this kind of like recanting about them ping-ponging off each other back and forth, describing, okay, well now the male character is going to be, pulling these two ropes. Well, what's on the end of the rope? Some bricks. No, that's not good. How about, this? Well, how about this? Well, how about this? And they just keep going back and forth. And I think at least how Bunel is setting it up is that this is a true collaboration between them. This isn't just Dali wrote something and he handed it to Bunel and Bunel went and filmed it. They're developing these ideas back and forth. And by most accounts, they had just a fantastic time working together on this film. This will not be the case for the next film that they partner on, but this one they definitely did. But let's step back a bit. Film plays a central role in surrealism. For example, André Breton fondly described during World War I days when he and a very close friend of his by the name of Jacques Vacher would intentionally go to different movie theaters at different moments in randomly different films. And what they liked about it was they were constructing a narrative out of these segments of films from different theaters that nobody else would experience or see. It was this idea that they were kind of taking control of the film story they were experiencing that day. This goes beyond just even their experiences and, I guess, going to many different films. When we think about the space of a movie theater, think about how it in many ways mimics the kind of reality they're trying to tap into, right? We're talking about these very dark, cavernous spaces. There is this bright, flickering imagery on the screen, and it's moving, it feels alive. And so in a lot of ways, film and the experience of seeing a film in a theater to them felt to some degree like the experience of surrealism itself. And this is enhanced by many people pointed out that film in a lot of ways is the premier surrealist medium, right? It is basically replicating a reality. It has movement and images and later sound. It has all these qualities to it that gets, at that time in the late 1920s, it gets into a sense of presenting an other reality that is as believable as the one that we all share. But this even goes beyond just that. The surrealists just loved film. They were fascinated by it. We have things like here on the right, a still image from a very famous series of films by Louis Fouillade, based on the popular pulp novels Fantômas. Fouillade made 5 films between 1913 and 1914, very rapidly, these film serials, and they were wildly popular, and the surrealists loved them. And part of the reason they loved them was the fact that these films present, the title character is basically a super criminal. He's somebody who breaks all the mores of society and literally the laws of society. He kills people. Here he is like sinisterly creeping up behind this guy at his desk. These are the types of things that the surrealists loved. And you can find this fascination with Fantômas, both the books and the films itself, but even certain actors and actresses in these films they really liked. So it's perhaps somewhat strange that when surrealists began to actually make films, they often fell flat. A great example of this, almost a kind of classic example, is this still image from one of the earliest surrealist films by Man Ray called Imak Bakia from 1926. Man Ray had found a patron who essentially gave him money and just said, just go make a film. And he had made previous films. This is not his first film, but in his autobiography, Man Ray describes how this was the first film that he consciously set out to make using the ideas of surrealism. And I think it's telling what he describes later. He says, quote, "My surrealist friends, whom I had invited to the showing, were not very enthusiastic. Although I thought I had complied with all the principles of surrealism, irrationality, automatism, psychological and dreamlike sequences without apparent logic, and complete disregard for conventional storytelling." So you can tell just in that passage, which he's writing long after the events, Man Ray is frustrated. He's like, I thought I made a film based on everything that you've been saying and writing and that we've been doing, and the surrealists didn't really care for it. Personally, I like Man Ray's surrealist films. I think they're great, but when you watch them, they're very evocative and they're very dreamlike. And to a certain degree, what they miss is something that Dali and Buñuel are going to tap into in spades in their films. And that is, they tap into not just these kind of irrational, dreamlike sequences, but also they tap into that core surrealist aspect of working against social norms. And that's something that, in a lot of ways, Man Ray doesn't really do in his films. But you will see that in Buñuel and Dali's films in just a moment. And even prior to Buñuel and Dali's entrance into the Surrealist movement in 1929, that core group back at the Residencia, Dali, Buñuel, Lorca, as students, they were lovers of movies, and they would go see films. They loved silent films, especially silent comedies. Dali had published a 1927 essay about film titled "Art Film's Anti-Artistic Spool," which he dedicated to Buñuel. The essay presents film in accordance with Dali's concept of what at this time he called anti-art. And this is just a phrase he gave for what we were discussing at the end of last week's lecture. It was Dali's not just promotion of a more traditional approach and a kind of technical proficiency, but also his kind of railing against what he saw as kind of false modernism. These kind of principles of modernism, of anything goes, that he felt the teachers at the Art Academy were promoting. Anti-art for him was the antithesis of that. And as many people have pointed out, don't take the word anti-art in the wrong way. It doesn't mean he's against art. He's against this kind of superfluous, unintelligent, slapdash modern art. So in the essay, Dali sets up a series of contrasts between art filmmakers and anti-art filmmakers. And here's just a few of them. Quote, "The anti-artistic filmmaker is unaware of art. He films in a pure way, obeying only the technical imperatives of his camera and the childish and very merry instinct of his sporty philosophy. The artistic filmmaker's knowledge of art is almost always crude, and he obeys the sentimental arbitrariness of his genius. The anti-artistic filmmaker limits himself to psychological, primary, constant, standardized emotions, aiming thereby to suppress anecdote." I think it's telling and important in those passages a few things. One is, and Dali was not alone in this, Buñuel and Lorca also fit into this sort of ideology, they hated anything overly sentimental. On top of that as well, notice that in a lot of ways, he is arguing for traditional standard filmmaking techniques. Part of what he's against are how art filmmakers, as he puts it, uses maximal dismemberment of emotions and filmmaking style, whereas an anti-art filmmaker appeals to a broad audience by resorting to standard filmmaking tropes and practices. This is, I think, really key, because this may be another type of argument against Man Ray's Surrealist film, is that it feels very, for lack of a better term, artsy. It feels very experimental. And what Dalí is arguing, even before he and Buñuel ever make a film, is that no, the best way for this type of Surrealist ideology to be put out there is by resorting to standard filmmaking techniques. So I think these qualities really outline, or that Dalí outlines in his essay, are critical for understanding what Un Chien Andalou becomes. It is a film that does not just try to evoke the dreamlike, as Man Ray's film does, but also taps into breaking many of the social norms. It's meant to be shocking, but that shock isn't always just something shocking happens. That shock also comes from just, we're watching a film that feels like a contemporary standard film, and then something odd occurs, and there's also that disruption as well. And so here are just two still photos. I'm assuming probably advertising photos. I haven't been able to see for sure. From Un Chien Andalou. And what I love about it is, these are, to some degree, not two of the most famous sequences. Certainly not on the left, but on the right is one, the sequence of a hand with a hole in it and ants coming out, which becomes just a standard Dalian trope, even in his paintings. So, at this point, Dalí, in very early 1929, has traveled to Paris partly to assist Buñuel in filming Un Chien Andalou. And by most accounts, he was not on set that often. There's at least one account where he was on set just like the last day or two, and he focused almost entirely on a sequence where there is a dead donkey on top of a piano, and he wanted to make sure the donkey looked right. That's what he really focused on. But again, Buñuel and Dalí are truly collaborating on this. One of Dalí's biographers, Ian Gibson, notes that Buñuel wrote Dalí in March 1929 to inform him filming on Un Chien Andalou would begin in April. Actually, it was going to begin in like 2 weeks. And Gibson notes Buñuel asked Dalí to specifically bring some ants, which were proving impossible to find in Paris, writing, quote, this is Buñuel to Dalí, "It depends on you whether I'll have to use caterpillars, flies, or rabbits in the hole in the hand." And I like that, just that tiny little touch, because it clearly shows that Dalí is the one who really desperately wants ants in that hand. And so Buñuel's like, I can't find them, you got to bring them. You bring the ants, we'll get this done. So there are still moments of this film that utterly shock. And when it premiered, I think the response is very fascinating. So before we talk about that, though, I think it is instrumental that you all experience the full film. In thinking about today, I was like, if I just show them segments, it's not going to have the same impact. So we're going to dedicate the next 60 minutes just watching all of Un Chien Andalou, and then we'll talk more about it afterwards. So, you guys ready? All right, here we go. go. Oh, I guess I closed it. Hang on one moment. I just have to take a breath. It is, I think, still a shocking film. And in fact, Palazzati notes that in 1989, MTV, at that time, the demarcator of all things hip and cool and kind of scandalous, aired a colorized version of Un Chien Andalou and cut most of its most famous sequences out of it, because they, even at that time, were still deemed just a little too shocking to air. Even today, I think the film feels fresh and frenetic. I think above all, funny is something, that we don't tend to think of. But that sequence when the guy rides into the bike and just falls over, I crack up every time. It's just, it's unquestionably funny. Many scholars have noted that, again, the primary inspiration for Buñuel and Dali was, in fact, silent comedies and slapstick. In particular, they were fans of the work of Harold Lloyd and his ability to play down his reactions for specifically comedic effect. And if you notice how often in the film the actors are not melodramatically overacting in a kind of silent film way, they tend to be playing down their responses and emotions a bit. When they let them out, at the most, it tends to be so over the top. It's that kind of frisson between how they normally act and then these moments of just like things bursting through. There are, as I'm sure you noticed, a lot of sequences and images that feel like Dali. That I think that last shot of the happy couple at the end, just impaled and buried in the sand, kind of looks like a Dali painting from that period. But so many people have just noted how in Un Chien Andalou in particular, there is this kind of emphasis on using sort of standard film techniques. I love the intertitles with the date changes, right? Because when it comes up, if you were a film goer at the time, you would expect those to help explain what's happening, and then the actual text in them, at 3 in the morning when someone walks up and rings the doorbell and it's in the middle of a scene. It doesn't end one scene and start another. It's like action is occurring. Or in the springtime. That sense of time, as indicated by those intertitles, is just further disrupted. So they're using the tropes of filmmaking, the commonality that the audience would understand of how films are made, to further make this feel very disruptive. Chaim Finkelstein has noted in particular how in some cases they tend to parody film tropes and conventions. I love the moment with the doorbell when he rings the bell, and at the time, if you think about a door buzzer and the way it kind of vibrates, and then the two hands come through with the shaker and it's shaking just really quickly. It's like that and it's gone. That's a little comedic kind of in-joke about films and how they reflect certain sounds, particularly in a silent film. You might have noticed that, again, despite all the strange things that occur in this film, the man losing his mouth, the woman's underarm hair turning into or vanishing, the severed hand in the street, the actors, again, never react in a way that display these as odd. And in fact, a lot of their reactions are things that if you go back and think about how Dali presents himself, in The Secret Life that we talked about over the last 2 weeks. I feel like that sequence when the girl's in the street cradling the box and the guy up in the apartment's just waiting for her to get hit by a car, that feels very much like the same kind of tenor of how Dali wants to present himself as well. These moments of kind of shocking violence that he's just building up for. There's, of course, very much a sort of sexual undertone to that as well. In many ways, this enhances what we could define as the surreality of the film. Odd things occur, but no one reacts. in a way that seems these odd things are abnormal. They react in a very normal way. I think that's shown very much at the end when the guy who's been shot and he just suddenly goes into a forest and collapses, and then out of nowhere just a group of men walk up as if they've just been waiting for a dead body to appear. There's this very kind of just everydayness to how people are reacting, be it lust, pettiness, anger. What is interesting is that reaction was certainly top of mind when the film was premiered on June 6, 1929. Buñuel later claimed that because of certain very violent audience reactions to previous avant-garde films in the past, he went to the premiere fully expecting the audience to riot. He says he put rocks in his pocket in case he had to throw them at people to defend himself. Now, Dalí, in his Secret Life, writes about the premiere this way, quote, the film produced the effect that I wanted, and it plunged like a dagger into the heart of Paris as I had foretold. Our film ruined in a single evening 10 years of pseudo-intellectual post-war advance-guardism, end quote. But this again proves Dalí's own brand of revisionism, as by almost all accounts, the film was a smashing success. Buñuel himself was surprised at the end of the film, the audience just adored it, including the Surrealists. It was critically lauded, it was publicly popular, it was slated to run for 2 months, and that was extended to 9 months, just to allow more people, 8 months, to allow people to see it at Montmartre Studio 28. There was a subset of this acclaim that, again, was of the Surrealists, who in many ways finally saw how a film could convey a full Surrealist sensibility, beyond dreamlike imagery, beyond this kind of poetic sense, into presenting a believable reality that tore at the fabric of social norms, an approach that Dalí will develop more fully in his own paintings and objects and art and writing by expressing deeply personal idiosyncrasies and refining them into a system of methods and interpretive models that we will explore more fully in 2 weeks. Thank you. And as usual, I'm happy to take any questions. Yes?
It just seemed like that, to me, that, something startling for that time period to me. And I wonder if the clarity of the audience there has something.
I mean, so the question is, the more sexually explicit aspects of the film, were they, I guess, how was that received or allowed? It's funny, I am not a film historian by any means, but my impression is that both in America before the film code in, the 1930s, I believe? 34, thank you. Before the film code in the U.S. and particularly in Europe as well, films tended to be a bit more explicit than we would assume they were today. So it was not uncommon to find nudity in silent films. I mean, it wasn't extremely common, but it wasn't atypical. Now, certainly the sexual violence the film implies is something that was shocking then and would be still shocking. It is still shocking today. But yeah, I think the audience was receptive enough to it that it, had this very popular response. But I think it is somewhat telling that even Buñuel was a little taken aback by that. He really expected the audience to be outraged. So, yeah, it's a great question. Yes?
So do you suppose that Rowan and Martin's laugh-in saw that?
The question is if Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In producer saw that. Could be. I mean, it's an immensely famous film. I don't know for sure. Definitely the filmmaker David Lynch, he almost considers himself a surrealist, and there are aspects of this film you can see in a lot of Lynch's films. That whole sequence with the severed hand in the street to me feels like something David Lynch would definitely draw from later in his career. So.
Dark Shadows did.
Dark Shadows, yeah, which was what, 50s or 60s? 60s. Yeah, again, I'm way out of my wheelhouse here with broader non-surrealist film history. Yes.
We had a speaker here, and they were talking about the 1960s, so it probably had a resurgence of that.
Right. Right. That's a fantastic point. And to add to that as well, if you notice, the copyright on this film is 1960, because I think it had been remastered for, so many that late 50s, 60s era students, and as the counterculture rises up, they're turning a lot to these earlier films. So, yeah. Yes. Yes. Oh, definitely, yeah. So the question is, what is the importance of the book that the woman throws down at the beginning? That is the fact that it is Vermeer's Lace Maker. She's looking at a book of art, and when she throws it down, it very much opens up into Vermeer's Lace Maker, which is another kind of Dalinian moment of his adoration for that particular artist, and it's something that Mark Rogovan talks about in the catalog for the show, in his essay about Vermeer as a point of inspiration for Dali. So I think there's even a still of that exact shot in the catalog. So, yeah. Yes. I have not, honestly. Yeah, I mean, we considered that when we were trying to get the sound to work, but I mean, you could. Now it's difficult, and I'd be curious. I just don't know if you know, Scott, if when it was premiered, if they just had a live performance, and was it the same music?
They said recently that it was the same music. That's why the well.
Okay.
Put the film together. Flip the record.
Yeah. Okay. No. That. Thank you for confirming that, because I was thinking, there are, like, as other examples, when Joseph Cornell premiered his first collage film in the U.S., which Dali was at, he at the back played an LP of a specific song that he wanted to play throughout the film, and later when the film got remastered, they took that specific piece of music and just edited it in. So when we think of these as silent films, we have to remember there usually was musical accompaniment with it. It's always a good question to know, like, was that the exact piece of music or was it something else? So thanks, Scott, because I was just not sure. I'm sorry? Why was it just that I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it certainly fits. I feel like the tonal theme of the film at the moments it comes up. So you have, it's during these kind of like death sequences essentially. So, but yes.
Could you explain the title? Translate the title?
That's a great question. The title is Unchen Andalou. It means Andalusian dog. Yeah, and that was, I mean, they went through a number of different titles. They always claimed it didn't mean anything, but some biographers have noted that Lorca took it personally because at the Residencia, kind of a common phrase for Southern Spanish, which he was one of them, was Andalusian dogs. So he kind of took it as like a slight at him in the region he was from, but Buñuel and Dali always claimed it didn't mean anything. So, yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for coming again. Thank you. And I will see you in 2 weeks when we start talking about what Dali brings to surrealism here at this critical juncture beyond the film that he and Buñuel made. So I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.